Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world, because stories like this always seem to find us at the exact hour we need them most. Maria Vance had never been the kind of woman who needed applause. She had spent most of her life doing difficult things quietly, the way some women carried grief in elegant shoes and a straight back, never letting the world see how much weight they were dragging behind them. By the time she was 68, people in town knew her as polished, composed, and dependable. They knew she had once run one of the most respected private catering services in Fairfield County. They knew she made food that could soften the coldest dining room and calm the tense egos of wealthy people who mistook money for character. They knew she was a widow. They knew she had one son. But they did not know the arithmetic of her life, how many dreams she had divided, sold, postponed, and buried to keep that life standing. When Maria was 29, her husband Thomas died after a construction accident that was followed by months of hospital bills and legal confusion. She was left not with a paid-off life insurance fortune, not with a generous inheritance, but with debt, a frightened 7-year-old boy, and a house that seemed to groan at night with all the things it could no longer afford. Daniel had stood in the hallway the week after the funeral, holding a toy car in his hand, and asked in a shaky voice, "Are we going to have to leave this house too?" Maria had bent down, cupped his face, and said, "Not if I can help it." That sentence became the law of her existence. She began by taking every kitchen job no one else wanted. She cooked breakfasts at an inn before sunrise, prepared lunch trays for a law firm by mid-morning, and baked pies for a local diner at night while Daniel slept in a back office with a blanket over him. She learned how to make a single roast chicken serve 3 separate clients. She learned how to smile at women who looked through her like she was part of the wallpaper. She learned that rich people often wanted comfort food plated like art, and that if she gave them both, they paid well and called again. Over time, talent did what pity never could. Maria built a name for herself. Her food was not flashy, but it was unforgettable. She understood restraint, flavor, timing. More than that, she understood people. She could tell when a hostess wanted praise, when a family wanted privacy, when a political donor wanted excess disguised as refinement. By her mid-40s, she had gone from hired cook to owner of Vance Table, a boutique catering company that became quietly indispensable to the kind of clients who never admitted they depended on anyone. But every step upward cost her something. She missed school assemblies. She missed field trips. She missed Daniel's first baseball trophy because she was serving a charity banquet for 200 guests and needed the check to cover the mortgage. When she got home, Daniel had been sitting at the kitchen table with the trophy beside a bowl of untouched cereal. He did not cry. That almost made it worse. "It's okay," he had said too quickly. "Coach said I'll probably get another one someday." Maria put down her purse and touched the little gold player fixed to the plastic base. "Daniel, I am so sorry." He shrugged with a smile that did not belong on a child's face. "You're working." That sentence became Daniel's sentence. As he grew older, it came to explain everything. "You're working. You're busy. You're tired. It's fine." At first, Maria believed he understood. Then she realized he had simply adapted to disappointment before he was old enough to resent it properly. Daniel grew into a handsome, careful young man with excellent manners and a quiet sensitivity he rarely showed outside the house. Maria noticed early that he hated feeling less than around other boys whose fathers drove expensive cars and whose mothers belonged to country clubs. He laughed along when classmates mocked discount shoes, but when he came home, he polished them until they shone like gilt. By high school, he had learned to conceal embarrassment with ambition. He worked hard, dressed neatly, and cultivated the kind of self-control that made teachers adore him. Yet beneath that polish, Maria saw something unsettled in him, something hungry. When he got into a good university with partial aid, Maria cried in the driveway after reading the acceptance letter. Daniel hugged her, smelling of clean laundry and winter air, and whispered, "No," she said, brushing tears from her cheeks. "You did." But she paid the rest anyway. She took on 2 more premium clients, gave up vacations, postponed dental work, and sold the last set of gold bracelets Thomas had once bought her on their 10th anniversary. She never told Daniel that part. Some sacrifices were too intimate to burden a child with, even a grown one. Years moved the way they always did, slowly while you were inside them and brutally fast once you looked back. Daniel graduated, entered the world of finance-adjacent consulting, and began making just enough money to taste a better life, but not enough to fully live it. He rented apartments that were always slightly too expensive, bought tailored coats on sale, and started talking about neighborhoods, schools, and professional circles as if he were trying to outrun the smell of struggle from his childhood. Maria did not hold that against him. In truth, she understood it. Poverty did not just bruise your body, it trained your imagination to kneel before other people's comfort. When Daniel was 34, he introduced her to Elise Cartwright. "She's brilliant," he said over dinner, trying to sound casual and failing. "And before you ask, no, she's not too good for me." Maria gave him a look over the rim of her wineglass. "That is an odd thing to say before your mother has even met the woman." Daniel smiled, but something in his expression tightened. "You know what I mean." Elise arrived 5 minutes early in a cream coat and soft leather gloves, carrying a box of expensive tea as a hostess gift. She was beautiful in a way that looked curated: silky blonde hair, composed posture, voice like chilled water over glass. She knew which fork to use without looking. She complimented Maria's braised short ribs with elegant precision. She asked intelligent questions about the catering business. She even laughed at the right moments. And yet, Maria, who had spent decades reading people across dining tables, noticed that Elise's eyes measured everything: the crown molding, the antique sideboard, the quality of the silver, Daniel's watch, her own posture. Every room seemed to become a test the moment Elise entered it. Still, she was gracious, more than gracious. She wanted Daniel to have ease in his life, to marry someone who would walk beside him and not become another burden he disguised as love. After Elise left that first night, Daniel lingered at the front door while Maria stacked plates in the kitchen. "Well?" he asked. Maria rinsed a dish and smiled. "She's polished." He frowned. "That sounds dangerous." "It's not dangerous, it's observant." "Did you like her?" Maria turned off the faucet and looked at him. "I think she matters to you, so yes, I want to." That answer relieved him more than he admitted. The wedding came the following spring at a restored estate by the water, tasteful and expensive without pretending otherwise. Maria paid more of it than anyone knew. The rehearsal dinner, the floral shortfall, the extra musicians Elise's mother insisted were necessary, the transportation problem no one had budgeted for, Maria solved all of it discreetly, the same way she had always solved things. Not because she was asked properly, but because she saw disaster approaching and refused to let it land on Daniel's happiness. At the reception, Maria watched her son dance with his bride under hanging lights, his face open in a way she had not seen since he was young. For one fragile hour, she allowed herself to believe that the hard part of her life was over. She imagined grandchildren one day, long dinners, Christmas mornings, a future shaped not by emergency, but by peace. That hope deepened when Daniel began talking about wanting a family home rather than another temporary apartment in a building full of strangers. "I'm tired of renting," he told her one Sunday as they walked through an open house in Westport. "I want something stable, something that lasts." Maria rested a hand on the banister and let those words settle in her chest. Something that lasts. For Daniel, stability had always been a longing. For Maria, it had always been an unpaid bill. Over the next year, Maria made a decision no one fully understood, except Gregory Hale, the attorney who had handled the sale of her company and her estate planning. After decades of work, Vance Table had become valuable enough for a profitable exit. Maria sold it while her reputation was still strong, keeping a modest consulting arrangement and freeing up capital she had never expected to hold in one place. Gregory reviewed the numbers across his polished desk and said, "Maria, you do realize you could live very comfortably on this without making any grand gestures for anyone." "I know. Do you?" The question landed cleanly. "Yes," he said, and this time he meant it. She agreed to meet him the following Sunday in the public garden, not at her apartment, not over some nostalgic dinner, not anywhere that would confuse access with forgiveness. Daniel understood the distinction and, for once, did not resent it. The day was cold and bright. Bare trees etched dark lines against a pale sky, and the pond reflected winter light with an honesty Daniel found hard to look at. Maria was already there when he arrived, seated on a bench in a camel coat, leather gloves folded neatly in her lap. Time had not diminished her. If anything, it had clarified her. There was more silver in her hair now, but also more stillness in the set of her shoulders. She looked like a woman who had stopped apologizing to herself. Daniel stood in front of her for a second longer than necessary before sitting down. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I live nearby," she answered. He almost smiled. That was what he had earned. Precision, not tenderness. He took a breath. "I had a medical scare a couple of weeks ago." Maria turned to him then, and concern passed across her face before discipline settled back over it. "Are you all right?" "Yes, or at least I'm not dying immediately, which appears to be the official verdict." She let that sit. "And why are you telling me?" "Because I almost died as the smallest version of myself," he thought. "Because I am tired of being a man who let comfort outrank decency. Because I finally understand that what I did was not passive, it was active surrender." But what he said was, "Because I don't want to keep lying to myself about who I've been." Maria looked ahead toward the path where two women were walking small dogs in synchronized winter coats. That would be a good place to begin. He nodded, then found, to his own embarrassment, that his voice had started to change. "The worst part is that I've replayed that night so many times, and for years I kept telling myself I froze, that I didn't know how to step in without making it worse, that I was under pressure from every direction." Maria said nothing. Daniel stared down at his hands. "But that wasn't true. I knew exactly what was happening. I just chose the easier loyalty." Now Maria spoke. "And what was easy about it?" "Nothing after that," he said with a broken laugh. "But in that moment, saying nothing meant I didn't have to challenge her in front of people. It meant I could pretend I would deal with it privately later. It meant I didn't have to risk the scene." He looked at her fully then, and his composure cracked. "I let you stand there alone." Maria's face remained composed, but her eyes had deepened with something painful and old. "Yes," she said softly, "you did." He bowed his head. "I am ashamed of that every day." "Good," she said, not cruelly, but clearly. Shame is sometimes the first honest room a person enters. He breathed out shakily. "Elise and I are not well." Maria did not rush to ask for details. "I think," he said, "that I kept mistaking harmony for the absence of conflict. I made that mistake with her. I made it with you. I told myself keeping the peace was maturity, when really I was just avoiding discomfort and calling it character." For the first time, Maria's expression softened, not into forgiveness, but into recognition. "That is an expensive lesson." "I know." He turned to her, desperate now, not for absolution, but for direction. "I don't know what I'm asking for exactly. Maybe a chance? Maybe just the right to tell you the truth." Maria was silent for a long while. Then she said, "The truth is not a gift you offer after the damage. It is rent you should have paid all along." He accepted that with a nod. Finally, she continued, "If you are here asking whether we can simply return to what existed before, the answer is no." "I know." "If you are here asking whether I will allow guilt to reopen my life in the exact shape that injured it, the answer is also no." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "That's fair." "What you need," Maria said, "is not a moment of emotional relief. You need a life that proves you understand what happened." He looked at her again. "Tell me how." "No," she said, "I won't design your conscience for you. But I will tell you the minimum conditions under which I would even consider rebuilding anything." He straightened slightly, listening the way he should have listened years ago. "You will live independently," Maria said, "not emotionally half-attached to chaos while calling it transition. You will separate your finances from Elise completely. You will seek counseling, not because it sounds responsible, but because you clearly do not yet understand why silence has been your favorite form of betrayal. You will repay what you realistically can over time, not because I need the money, but because debts named properly tend to teach the debtor. And you will stop assuming that being my son grants you access to my home, my time, or my private life." Daniel felt each sentence as both wound and rescue. "If I do those things," Maria looked at him steadily, "then time will tell me whether you have changed. Not tears, not apologies. Time." He nodded once. "I can do that." She rose from the bench. "We'll see." That winter, Daniel did begin. He moved out within 3 months, renting a modest one-bedroom apartment with narrow windows and indifferent carpeting. It was the first place he had ever paid for entirely on his own, without inherited comfort hidden somewhere in the foundation. He met with a therapist every Thursday evening. At first he hated it, then resented how much of his life made sense once he stopped defending it. He learned that conflict avoidance often masks a deeper hunger to remain liked at any moral cost. He learned that he had spent years outsourcing self-respect to other people's approval. He learned that children raised by sacrifice sometimes mistake love for a resource that renews automatically, no matter how carelessly consumed. His marriage, once exposed to honesty, deteriorated fast. Elise mocked therapy, then mocked boundaries, then mocked his late moral awakening. When she discovered he had opened separate accounts and refused to absorb several discretionary expenses she considered non-negotiable, the final veneer shattered. "So this is who you are now?" she demanded one evening. "A man trying to cosplay humility because his mother cut him off?" Daniel looked at her from across the dining table of the house they no longer filled with guests. "No, this is who I might have been if I'd had a spine sooner." Her face hardened. "You blame me for everything. I blame myself first. That's the difference between us." The divorce did not arrive through one explosive betrayal, though there was later a rumor, then confirmation, that Elise had grown close to a wealthy developer she met through one of her social circles. By then, Daniel barely reacted. The marriage had already become a museum of performances neither of them believed in anymore. What ended it was simpler and sadder. Once the money thinned and the illusions cracked, there was very little left between them that could survive ordinary truth. By the end of the following year, Daniel was divorced, employed in a steadier role that lacked glamour but paid honestly, and living a life stripped of ornament. It was not impressive, it was real. He sent Maria monthly repayments she did not request acknowledgement for. Sometimes she texted a brief "received." Sometimes she said nothing at all. He kept sending them. And for the first time in his life, Daniel began to understand that redemption was not a speech delivered at the right moment. It was repetition. It was choosing, again and again, to become the kind of man who would never stand silently in the wrong room while someone else was being diminished. 5 years after the night Maria Vance had stood in her own kitchen and heard the words that split her life in two, the house no longer belonged to memory in the way it once had. Time had done what rage alone could not do. It had thinned the poison out of the walls. Not erased it. Nothing that humiliates you in the center of your own dignity is ever fully erased. But time had changed the meaning of the place, and Maria, who had once built that house as a promise to her son, now stood ready to give it a second purpose that asked nothing from him at all. The idea had begun quietly, as the best ideas in her life often did. Second Table had grown well beyond what anyone first expected. What had started in Boston as a modest training initiative for women over 50, widows, divorced women, displaced caregivers, women too long ignored by industries obsessed with youth and polish, had become something more serious. Foundations had begun paying attention. Hospitality groups had begun partnering with her. Former participants had found work in boutique inns, private kitchens, event companies, and even their own small food businesses. One woman, a former school secretary abandoned after 32 years of marriage, now ran pastry operations at a coastal inn in Maine. Another had opened a soup and bread lunch service in Providence. Maria kept handwritten notes from all of them in a leather box by her desk. What she could not solve in Boston, however, was housing. Too many women arrived on the edge of practical ruin. Some had skill, but no safe place to stay while retraining. Some were sleeping in relatives' guest rooms where they were treated like burdens. Some had enough dignity left to work, but not enough stability left to begin. Maria understood that kind of halfway life intimately. Survival often failed not because a person lacked talent, but because she had nowhere secure from which to rebuild. The answer had been waiting in Connecticut all along. For years after Daniel and Elise left, Maria had kept the old house maintained, but mostly unused, save for seasonal staff visits, repairs, and occasional planning retreats. She could have sold it, and several people had told her to do just that. The market was strong, the property had appreciated beautifully. Gregory had run the numbers more than once and, in his dry attorney's voice, reminded her that sentiment was not an asset class. But the house had not felt like sentiment to Maria anymore. It felt unfinished. One evening in Boston, while reviewing participant files with Priya and 2 program coordinators, Maria spread a site map of the Connecticut property across her dining table. The kitchen light fell softly over the old blueprint, the garden sketches, and the legal pad on which she had written "Residential Fellowship" 3 times in different handwriting pressures. Priya leaned in first. "You're serious?" Maria rested her hand over the edge of the map. "I am considering it." Lena, one of the coordinators, blinked in surprise. "You mean turning the whole property into a live-work fellowship house?" "Yes." Priya looked up with a slow smile. "That's not a small idea." Maria returned the smile faintly. "The older I get, the less interested I am in small ideas." The conversion took planning, patience, and more emotional honesty than she had anticipated. Gregory, though skeptical at first, drew up the legal framework. The house would be transferred into a charitable residential trust affiliated with Second Table. The structure would protect the property from future personal claims, preserve its mission, and establish long-term operational oversight beyond Maria's lifetime. She wanted durability now, not merely intention. Too much of her life had already been spent repairing what other people treated casually. When Gregory came to Boston to review the final documents, he sat across from her in the same calm posture he had maintained through every phase of her undoing and rebuilding. "You understand," he said, adjusting his glasses, "that once this is done, the house is no longer a family asset in any practical sense." Maria looked out the window for a moment before answering. It stopped being a family asset the night my family confused access with entitlement. Gregory nodded once. Then let's do it correctly. She signed without trembling. Renovations began the following spring. Unlike the first renovation years earlier, when Maria had supervised with the private hope of creating a beautiful nest for Daniel's future, this time every choice was guided by use, dignity, and resilience. Guest bedrooms became resident suites with locks, desks, and practical storage. The upstairs sitting room became a counseling and interview space. The sunroom was converted into a reading and planning lounge. The back office became an administrative room with file cabinets, resource boards, and a workstation for case coordination. The garden was restored not for decorative prestige, but for herbs, edible flowers, and outdoor gathering. And the kitchen that had once become the stage of her humiliation, was redesigned yet again. Maria kept the bones of what she loved: the light, the wide island, the deep farmhouse sink. But the room no longer belonged to performance. She had the decorative excess stripped back. She installed durable open shelving, labeled storage, training stations, commercial-grade prep surfaces, and a long communal table down the center where women could chop, knead, learn, talk, and rebuild without anyone being made to feel ornamental. When Priya visited during the final phase and stood in the center of the room, she turned slowly and said, "This feels healed." Maria looked around, absorbing the sound of drills in the hallway and the afternoon light warming the counters. "No," she said softly, "it feels useful, which is sometimes better." Daniel learned of the project not from Maria directly, but from the formal announcement Second Table released once the fellowship house was nearing completion. By then, 4 years had passed since their winter meeting in the public garden, and his life had become quiet in the ways that rarely impress anyone and often save them. He kept the same modest apartment. He had remained in his steady job and, to his own surprise, done well enough to earn the respect that comes from consistency rather than charm. He had continued therapy, though less frequently now. He had not remarried, had not rushed into reinvention, had not tried to decorate repentance into some dramatic personal brand. Most importantly, he had not stopped doing the ordinary work Maria demanded. Every month he sent repayment, even when Maria never mentioned it. Every few weeks he wrote brief, honest messages. "Hope your event in Newport went well. I read the article about the fellowship expansion. Congratulations. I know I have no right to say this, but I'm proud of you." Maria responded rarely, and when she did, it was with measured civility. Over time, however, the ice between them changed texture. It did not vanish, it simply stopped cutting every time he came near it. When Daniel read the fellowship announcement, he sat at his kitchen counter for a long time, staring at the line that described the Connecticut property as a residential and training home for women rebuilding their lives after widowhood, displacement, financial betrayal, or abandonment. The words struck him with almost unbearable precision. His mother had taken the place where she was diminished and turned it into shelter for others who had been discarded. There was nothing theatrical in that, no revenge headline, no legal bragging, just transformation. He wrote to her that evening. "I heard about the house. It's extraordinary. I don't know if you'd want me there, but if there is an opening ceremony, I would like to attend quietly, only if it would not burden you." Maria did not answer that night. She answered 3 days later. "You may attend. Quietly is a good instinct." Daniel read the message 3 times before setting the phone down. The opening ceremony took place in early October, under a sky so clear it made every outline seem deliberate. The garden had been restored fully by then. Late roses climbed the fence, herb boxes lined the back path. The front steps, once used by guests who measured the house in terms of status, were now bordered by modest arrangements of seasonal flowers grown partly on site. Cars arrived steadily, but the atmosphere was nothing like Elisa's old dinners. There was no brittle prestige in the air. The guests were donors, program graduates, local press, partner chefs, counselors, and women who understood exactly what it meant to need one stable place from which to begin again. Maria stood near the entry greeting people in a dark green dress and a wool wrap, elegant without performance. She was 73 now. Age had refined rather than reduced. There was softness in her face where peace had finally found residence, and firmness in her posture where self-respect had settled permanently. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early and stopped at the gate for a moment before stepping in. The last time he had crossed that threshold as a resident, he had done so under the false assumption that time would somehow excuse what character had failed to do. Now he entered like a guest who knew the privilege of being admitted at all. Maria saw him before he reached the front walk. Their eyes met across the garden. For a second, the years between the kitchen and the present seemed to gather themselves around them, not to reopen, but to be acknowledged. She did not rush toward him. She did not freeze. She simply waited. He approached and said, "Thank you for letting me come." "You came on time," she replied. A faint, surprised laugh escaped him. "I thought that might matter." "It does." He nodded, absorbing the small mercy hidden in that exchange. Maria looked at him carefully. He was leaner now, less polished, more honest in the face. The expensive confidence was gone. What remained was humbler, and for the first time in years, trustworthy enough to observe. "You look well," she said. "So do you." She inclined her head and turned to greet another guest, but not before saying, "There are programs in the back room if you want one. We'll begin in 15 minutes. That was all. Yet Daniel felt with almost painful clarity that he had just been given something more valuable than forgiveness performed in public. He had been treated as a person rather than a permanent accusation. Inside, the house had transformed. Women moved through the rooms with purpose. Some wore chef whites for demonstrations, some carried trays, some stood near the resource boards explaining program tracks to visitors. The old upstairs room where Maria once kept family papers now held welcoming baskets for incoming residents. The kitchen glowed with preparation and motion, not display. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment and watched two women in aprons laugh over chopped thyme while Priya explained storage logistics to a donor. "This used to be my mother's favorite room," he said quietly. Priya, who had recognized him from photographs but never met him in person, glanced over. "I think it still is," she said. When the ceremony began, guests gathered in the garden under a canopy. Maria stepped to the front not like a social hostess, but like a woman who knew precisely what the house meant because she had paid for every version of it with a different piece of herself. She did not tell the entire family story. She did not need to. Maria had long since outgrown the need to explain her scars to people who had not earned access to them. Instead, she spoke about practical dignity, about late-life displacement, about the cruelty of making capable women feel obsolete, and about the power of one safe address. "There comes a moment in many lives," she said, her voice carrying evenly through the crisp air, "when a person realizes that losing a place is not the worst thing. The worst thing is being made to feel that your labor, your love, and your history have no claim to belonging. This house will exist to tell women the opposite. Here, what you have survived will not disqualify you from beginning again. It will be honored as evidence that you know how." Applause rose slowly, then fully. Daniel looked down because his eyes had filled. Near the back, unnoticed by most, another figure had paused outside the gate and then retreated before entering fully. Elise, one of the former women from her old social circle, had apparently mentioned the event, and curiosity had drawn her there, if only for a moment. She had come alone, wearing the same kind of cultivated elegance she once believed could substitute for substance. But from the path she saw enough: the press placard, the women in aprons, the donors speaking Maria's name with respect, the front sign reading Vance House Fellowship Home, and understood in an instant what had truly happened. Maria had not clung to the house out of bitterness, she had turned it into legacy, and Elise, who once believed ownership meant social control, now stood outside the property not because of legal paperwork alone, but because she had never learned how to make herself worthy of the rooms she entered. She left before anyone needed to ask her to. After the ceremony, guests were invited inside for lunch prepared by second table fellows and mentors. The communal kitchen filled with voices, plates, warm bread, and the unmistakable pulse of useful joy. Daniel remained mostly to the side, helping only when asked. At one point, one of the resident women, unaware of the full family history, handed him a tray and said, "Could you bring these bowls to the back table, please?" Daniel took them immediately. Of course. Maria saw him from across the room. There was no grand reconciliation scene, no sobbing embrace in front of strangers. That would have cheapened everything both of them had survived. Instead, there was something smaller and therefore truer. Daniel moved quietly through the kitchen carrying soup bowls, setting down bread baskets, wiping a spill no one else had yet noticed. Not performing humility, simply practicing it. Later, as the afternoon thinned and the last guests drifted toward the garden, Maria stood by the wide back window where the October light rested on the herb beds. Daniel approached carefully, as he always did now when entering emotional territory that no longer belonged to him by default. "It's beautiful," he said. Maria kept her eyes on the garden. "It's useful." He smiled faintly. "Yes, better word." After a pause, he added, "I know I don't have any claim to this place. I just want you to know I understand now, more than I did before. Maybe not fully, but enough to know what you built here is bigger than anything I once thought I was losing." Maria turned to look at him. Her face was calm, lined gently by time and the kind of peace that does not come cheap. "That is because you thought the house was the inheritance." "And it wasn't?" "No," she said. "The inheritance was the example. You almost threw that away." He accepted the sentence with lowered eyes. "I know." For a long moment they stood in silence, not empty silence, but the kind that forms when people have finally stopped lying to each other. Then Maria said, "There's a tray of tea things by the side counter. Bring me 1 cup and 1 for yourself. The good black tea, not the herbal nonsense." Daniel blinked, then laughed softly in disbelief. "All right." He brought the cups back carefully, just as he had done as a boy when trying very hard not to spill something she could not afford to replace. Maria took hers, and together they stood by the window drinking tea in the kitchen that had once broken them both in different ways. Outside, the garden rustled under the evening light. Inside, women were still laughing at the long table. And Maria understood, with the quiet certainty that only comes at the end of a hard-won life chapter, that walking out without a fight had never been surrender. It had been the first clean act of self-respect after years of love offered too cheaply. The number she dialed that night had not merely protected a house, it had protected the remainder of her life. In the end, that was the real victory. Not that her son became ashamed, not that her daughter-in-law lost access, not even that the law had been on her side. It was this: The place where she had once been told she did not belong had become a home for women who needed proof that they still could, and Maria, at last, belonged entirely to herself. Maria folded her hands. "I'm not interested in grand gestures." He arched an eyebrow. "No? Then what do you call buying a large property, financing its renovation, and setting it up for your son's family to live in?" She met his gaze steadily. Insurance against the instability he grew up with. Gregory leaned back with the sigh of a man who had known her long enough to recognize both her intelligence and her dangerous tenderness. "Then do it correctly." She did. The house they found was not grand in the vulgar sense, but it was beautiful, an older colonial with generous windows, a deep kitchen, a mature garden, and enough room for multiple generations without anyone stepping on each other's pride. Maria paid for the purchase. Maria paid for the roof replacement, the pipes, the electrical update, the custom kitchen cabinetry, the stone counters, and the long walnut table where she imagined holidays unfolding with laughter instead of exhaustion. She set the ownership through a carefully structured trust, believing prudence could protect love from the chaos of the future. When Daniel first walked through the finished kitchen, he turned in a slow circle and said, almost like a boy again, "Mom, this is incredible." Maria smiled. A house should make people breathe easier the moment they enter it. Elise touched the edge of the marble island and said, "It's stunning. Honestly, Maria, I didn't know you had this kind of taste." The sentence was flattering on its surface, but Maria still heard the surprise underneath it. They all moved in during early autumn. For a while, the arrangement seemed promising. Sunday breakfasts returned, Daniel looked less strained, Elise hosted tasteful dinners. The rooms filled with flowers, candles, and that delicate noise a house makes when it is being lived in with intention. Maria allowed herself, just a little, to believe she had finally built what Thomas's death had taken from them long ago. But even in those early months, there were small shadows where light should have been. Elise began referring to certain rooms as our spaces, and Maria's downstairs study as your area, as though territorial lines were already being drawn inside a house created for shared shelter. She made little jokes about old-fashioned habits, about Maria still thinking like staff when she reorganized the pantry for function instead of display. Daniel never laughed loudly at those remarks, but he did not challenge them either. He smoothed things over. He changed subjects. He kissed his wife's cheek and said, "Come on, Elise," in a tone too gentle to mean anything. Maria noticed. Maria always noticed. Still, she said nothing. She had not spent a lifetime building safety just to become the first storm inside it. If part 1 was the story of what Maria built, then part 2 was the story of what other people slowly assumed they had the right to inherit before she was even gone. For the first 6 months in the house, Maria told herself the tensions were normal. No two generations could live under one roof without learning each other's rhythms, and she had not entered the arrangement expecting gratitude every morning or applause every evening. She knew what it meant to share space. She knew compromise had a cost. What troubled her was not the friction itself, but the direction of it. Every small discomfort inside the house seemed to require adjustment from her, and almost none from Daniel and Elise. At first, it came dressed as modern preference. Elise wanted the entryway mirror moved because it made the front hall feel older. She replaced Maria's practical linen napkins with pale, imported ones no one was allowed to actually use. She hired florists for intimate dinners Maria knew could have been set beautifully with clipped garden roses. She ordered decorative serving pieces that looked elegant in photographs and broke under ordinary handling. Whenever Maria offered a more sensible solution, Elise smiled with that polished softness that was somehow more cutting than open rudeness. "Oh, I know that's how things used to be done, but I really want the house to feel current." The house, not our house, not your house, just the house, as though language itself could blur ownership if it was repeated often enough. Daniel, meanwhile, had entered one of those dangerous phases of adulthood in which appearances begin to cost more than they return. His job title sounded more stable than his actual finances were. He had moved into a partnership opportunity with two acquaintances who talked like visionaries and handled money like gamblers. Maria did not fully trust either of them the first time she met them over drinks on the terrace. One wore confidence like cologne, and the other interrupted everyone in the room, especially people who actually knew what they were talking about. "What exactly does the business do?" Maria had asked one evening. Daniel gave a quick laugh. "Mom, it's not that simple." Most honest businesses are simple when you strip away the language. One of the partners had smiled thinly. "With respect, Mrs. Vance, modern investment structures are a bit more complex than catering contracts." Maria had looked at him with steady calm. And yet both can collapse if led by people who mistake presentation for competence. Daniel had changed the subject too quickly. Elise later told him Maria could be a bit severe with people she didn't understand. Maria heard that sentence in passing from the hallway and said nothing, though she understood more than either of them suspected. By spring, Daniel's so-called opportunity had begun draining cash. The first signs were subtle. He stopped suggesting dinners out, started taking calls outside, and stared too long at invoices before folding them away. Then came requests dressed as temporary favors. "Mom," he said one afternoon, standing awkwardly in the kitchen with a coffee mug in his hands, "the business is just in a tightening phase, nothing dramatic. There's a short-term liquidity issue." Maria did not look up from the receipts she was organizing. "How much?" Daniel exhaled. "I knew you were going to ask that." "That is because I am the sort of woman who likes nouns and numbers." He gave a strained smile, then told her the amount. Maria slowly removed her glasses. "That is not a tightening phase. That is a wound. It's temporary. It is always temporary until it becomes a pattern." He sat down at the table. "I just need help getting through this quarter." Maria studied his face. Beneath the adult polish, she saw traces of the boy who used to hide worry by speaking too calmly. "Is this the first time you've covered losses?" Daniel hesitated. "No." She closed the folder in front of her. "And Elise knows." "She knows enough." Maria leaned back in her chair. "That means no." In the end, she helped. Not because she approved, but because she had spent too many years rescuing what she could not bear to watch collapse. She did it through a formal, temporary loan structure Gregory helped draft, though Daniel signed it with embarrassment and Elise with visible irritation. "I don't see why everything has to be documented like a courtroom proceeding," Elise said once Gregory left the sitting room. Maria folded the papers neatly. "Because memory changes when money disappears." Elise lifted one shoulder. "In my family, people simply help each other." Maria met her eyes. "In many families, people also remember who paid." That exchange should have been a warning to them all. Instead, the household continued on as if tension could be styled away like clutter. Summer came, and with it Elise's growing obsession with positioning. She had fallen into a social orbit of women who discussed schools for children they did not yet have, properties they did not own, and vacations bought with debt disguised as taste. Maria watched these women arrive in flowing dresses and impossible sandals, praising the home as though they had discovered it themselves. "This kitchen is extraordinary," said one of them during a wine evening Elise hosted in June. "It feels so European." Elise, arranging olives onto a ceramic dish Maria had paid for, smiled and said, "That's exactly what I wanted." Maria was standing near the stove at the time, heating fig preserves for an appetizer she had prepared because, despite everything, she still could not bear the thought of guests being poorly fed. She glanced up at Elise, who did not correct the implication. Not once did she say Maria designed it. Not once did she say Maria chose the layout, tested the lighting, selected the tile, or paid every contractor invoice attached to that room. Daniel heard it too. Maria knew he did, but he only looked down into his glass. The next few months were a quiet education in erasure. Elise began hosting more frequently, always with the same performative effortlessness, always with Maria either cooking in the background or being encouraged to take the evening off, while still somehow ending up responsible for the details that kept the evening from failing. There were little humiliations disguised as logistics. "Could you use the side pantry tonight?" Elise asked, smiling too brightly. "I just don't want too many people crowding the main kitchen while guests are here." Maria had looked at her for a long moment. "You mean you do not want me visible?" Elise's expression tightened. "I didn't say that." "No, you did not. You did not need to." Even Daniel seemed to be splitting into two men. The son who softened around Maria in private, and the husband who stiffened beside Elise in public. In private, he still asked whether she was sleeping well, whether she wanted him to drive her to appointments, whether she thought the hydrangeas along the back fence were struggling from too much sun. In front of Elise's circle, however, he seemed to shrink into politeness and let things pass that should never have passed. Then autumn came again, bringing the sharp smell of leaves and the kind of cool light that made every room in the house look beautifully honest. Daniel's financial troubles had worsened. One partner had left, the other had become elusive. Bills multiplied quietly. Maria became aware of more than she was told because she knew how to read overdue notices tucked too quickly into drawers and the anxious silence that follows banking calls. And yet, at the exact moment the household should have become humbler, Elise became more demanding. She announced that the kitchen appliances no longer matched the image of the house. Maria nearly laughed the first time she heard it. "The image?" she repeated. Elise stood beside the refrigerator with a catalog open on the counter. "Maria, please don't take this personally. It's just that if we're going to be entertaining the way we've been entertaining, the kitchen needs to reflect the level of the property." Maria placed her teacup down carefully. "The appliances work. They function," she corrected, "but they don't impress." Maria's gaze sharpened. "A stove is meant to cook, not flatter insecure people." Daniel, who had just entered the room, exhaled. "Can we not do this right now?" Elise turned to him. "I'm talking about maintaining standards." Maria looked at her son instead. "With whose money?" Silence held the room for a moment too long. A week later, Maria discovered Elise had already met with a showroom consultant and selected an upgraded appliance package with imported finishes, custom hardware, and an installation schedule that would require partial reconstruction. Daniel admitted he had hoped Maria might consider covering it as an investment in the home. Maria stared at him across the breakfast table. "An investment for whom?" "For the property," he said weakly. "No," Maria replied, "for the illusion." But because she was still trying to protect the house from becoming a battlefield, because she still believed she could preserve dignity through strategic peace, Maria compromised. She paid for a high-quality but less extravagant replacement package and told herself that restraint now would prevent larger conflict later. Gregory handled the contractor payments. Maria personally approved the timing and supervised the work. The installation finished on a Thursday. On Friday evening, Elise hosted a small dinner for two of Daniel's new professional contacts, a man who spoke too loudly and laughed before his own stories were finished. Maria had spent the afternoon out handling the final vendor invoice and collecting a receipt folder from Gregory's office. When she returned, just after sunset, the house was already glowing with candlelight. She could hear voices and glassware from the dining room. She had no intention of joining them, All she wanted was to step into the kitchen, set down her papers, and make herself a cup of tea. As she entered, Elise was standing near the new range in a fitted ivory dress, one hand resting on the marble island as if she were posing for a magazine spread. Two women stood nearby admiring the appliances. Daniel was opening a bottle of wine at the counter. The sight was so composed, so smugly complete, that for a second Maria felt as though she had walked into a room staged to remove every trace of her. One of the guests ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the new oven. "Elise, this is exquisite. You two have really made the house your own." Maria heard the sentence. Daniel heard it too. Elise smiled without turning right away. Then she saw Maria in the doorway, holding the receipt envelope in one hand. There was a pause, one of those tiny pauses in which a decent person corrects the atmosphere. Elise did not. Instead, with calm coldness sharpened by audience, she lifted her chin and said, "Well, yes, this is our home now, not yours." The room went still. One of the guests looked down immediately, the way people do when they recognize cruelty but lack the character to interrupt it. Daniel froze with the wine bottle in his hand, not shocked enough to defend her, just shocked enough to understand, in the same instant Maria did, that a line had been crossed in front of witnesses and could never again be called accidental. Maria's first feeling was not rage, it was clarity. She looked at Elise, then at Daniel. She saw the cowardice in his silence before he had even chosen it fully. She saw, too, that this moment was not born tonight. It had been assembling itself for months in every uncorrected slight, every convenient ambiguity, every time love had been mistaken for permission. Daniel finally said, too softly, "Elise." But the damage was already complete. Maria placed the receipt envelope on the sideboard with perfect care. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask anyone to leave. She did not defend herself to people unworthy of the explanation. Instead, she said, "I see." That was all. Then she turned, walked through the hall, took her coat from the stand, and stepped out onto the back porch where the October air hit her face with a coldness that felt cleaner than the house behind her. Her hands did not shake. That surprised even her. She opened her handbag, removed her phone, and stared at the screen for only a moment before pressing a number she had not needed in months, but had never deleted. Gregory Hale answered on the second ring. "Gregory?" he said at once, hearing something in the silence before she spoke. "What happened?" She looked through the porch glass at the kitchen she had paid for, at the son who still had not followed her outside, and at the woman standing where dignity should have lived. Then she said with terrifying calm, "Gregory, I need you at the house tomorrow morning. Bring the trust documents." The next morning, the house did not feel like a home. It felt like a courtroom waiting for the judge. Maria rose before sunrise, though she had barely slept, not because she was unsure of what she had done, but because the body often trembled after the heart has already made its decision. She dressed carefully in navy wool slacks and a cream blouse, added pearl earrings she had not worn in months, and pinned her silver hair back with the quiet precision of a woman refusing to look undone in the face of humiliation. When she passed the hall mirror, she paused only briefly. There were shadows under her eyes, but her expression was composed. She went downstairs before anyone else and made coffee in the very kitchen where Elise had dismissed her the night before. The new machine hummed, the imported oven gleamed, the marble reflected the cool morning light as though nothing dishonorable had happened there. Maria poured her coffee into a plain white cup and stood at the sink looking out into the back garden where the roses were beginning to thin for the season. Behind her, footsteps entered the kitchen. Daniel. He looked exhausted, the handsome confidence of his face replaced by the strained boyish guilt he had only worn a handful of times in his life. He had always been most like his father in moments of collapse. Thomas, too, had once had that dangerous softness that made women forgive him faster than they should. Daniel finally said, too softly, "Elise." But the damage was already complete. Maria placed the receipt envelope on the sideboard with perfect care. She did not raise her voice, she did not ask anyone to leave, she did not defend herself to people unworthy of the explanation. Instead, she said, "I see." That was all. Then she turned, walked through the hall, took her coat from the stand, and stepped out onto the back porch where the October air hit her face with a coldness that felt cleaner than the house behind her. Her hands did not shake. That surprised even her. She opened her handbag, removed her phone, and stared at the screen for only a moment before pressing a number she had not needed in months, but had never deleted. Gregory Hale answered on the second ring. "Gregory?" he said at once, hearing something in the silence before she spoke. "What happened?" She looked through the porch glass at the kitchen she had paid for, at the son who still had not followed her outside, and at the woman standing where dignity should have lived. Then she said with terrifying calm, "Gregory, I need you at the house tomorrow morning. Bring the trust documents." He said nothing. Maria placed her cup down. "Gregory will be here at 9. Daniel stared. "Gregory?" "Yes." His color changed slightly. "Why?" Maria held his gaze. "Because unlike the rest of this household, Gregory understands the difference between affection and ownership." For the first time, fear entered Daniel's expression without disguise. "Mom, what exactly are you doing?" "What I should have done the moment this arrangement stopped being built on respect." He stood up. "You're overreacting." Maria's eyes sharpened, and the old steel of her survival came fully into view. "Your wife told me I had no place in a kitchen I paid for. You stood there and let her. Do not insult me further by calling my dignity an overreaction." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. Elise entered not long after, wrapped in a silk robe that suggested she still believed presentation could govern outcome. But even she seemed unsettled. Maria could tell Daniel had tried to speak with her upstairs, because Elise wore the brittle poise of someone angry when consequences had arrived too quickly. "Maria," she said, as though attempting civility might reset the world, "I think last night got out of hand." Maria looked at her evenly. "No, last night revealed what was already in hand." Elise folded her arms. "I admit I was sharper than I should have been, but I will not be painted as some monster for wanting clear boundaries in a shared home." The phrase "shared home" almost impressed Maria with its audacity. "A shared home?" Maria repeated. "Tell me, Elise, when you refer to sharing, do you include the roof I paid for, the taxes, the renovations, the legal structure, or do you mean you enjoy possession without the burden of contribution?" Elise's jaw tightened. "This isn't productive." "No, but it is accurate." The doorbell rang at exactly 9. Gregory Hale entered with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades turning family sentiment into enforceable language. He wore a charcoal suit, carried a leather briefcase, and nodded to Maria first. "Mrs. Vance." "Maria." He glanced at Daniel and Elise with professional neutrality. "Mr. Vance." "Mrs. Vance." Elise gave the faintest frown at being addressed by Daniel's surname in a room where legal realities were about to matter more than social tone. They moved into the sitting room. Gregory laid out a file so neatly it seemed almost ceremonial. Maria sat in the armchair nearest the window. Daniel remained standing at first, as if refusing the optics of subordination. Elise sat beside him on the sofa, chin lifted. Gregory removed his glasses, then spoke in the measured tone of someone who knew that clarity was often kinder than comfort. "As requested, I'm here to review the ownership and residency structure of this property," he said. "Maria Vance is the sole beneficial owner through the Vance Residential Trust. The house was acquired, renovated, and maintained with her funds. Occupancy by Daniel Vance and spouse has been permitted under revocable residential provisions contingent on respectful cohabitation and other conditions." Daniel stared. Revocable? Gregory looked at him. Yes. Elise leaned forward. I'm sorry, are you saying we have no rights here? Gregory clasped his hands. I'm saying your rights are limited, conditional, and subordinate to the trust holder's decisions. That can't be right, Elise said. Gregory gave a thin, professional smile. I assure you, it is. Maria did not enjoy their shock as much as she might have once imagined. That was the strange thing about pain. Once it cut deeply enough, vindication no longer tasted sweet. It only tasted late. Daniel sank into a chair as if his legs had lost cooperation. Mom, why would you do it this way? Maria answered him without softness. Because I spent my life cleaning up the emotional and financial wreckage of trusting people who promised love would be enough. Gregory slid several papers across the coffee table. Effective today, Maria has elected to modify residency permissions. You will be granted a limited transition period to secure alternative housing. During that time, access to certain household accounts, service arrangements, and discretionary property decisions is suspended. Elise stared at the documents without touching them. You're throwing us out. Maria's expression did not change. I am correcting your misunderstanding. Daniel looked stricken. Please, don't do this. We can fix this. Maria turned to him, and for the first time that morning her voice lowered with something more wounded than cold. You should have fixed it when it was only a sentence. You waited until it became a structure. No one spoke after that for several seconds. Outside, a gardener's truck moved along the distant road. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator motor clicked on. Ordinary sounds continued, indifferent to the rearrangement of a family. By the end of the week, Gregory had formalized everything. Daniel and Elise were given 60 days to leave. Maria did not throw their clothes onto the lawn. She did not embarrass them publicly. She did not call relatives for sympathy. She moved with disciplined efficiency, the way she had moved through widowhood, debt, and business crises. Order had always been her response to collapse. Yet once the legal steps were in place, Maria understood something else with painful clarity. Even if Daniel and Elise were gone, the house itself was now spoiled. Not ruined structurally, not financially, but inwardly. Too many memories had curdled there too quickly. She could still picture Elise's hand on the kitchen island, hear the icy smoothness of that sentence, see Daniel's silence spreading like a stain across the room. A home could survive damage. It rarely survived contempt. So Maria made another decision. 2 weeks later, she signed a lease on a gracious apartment in Boston overlooking a tree-lined square, a place with tall windows, pale walls, and none of the weight of family expectation built into its corners. It was not as large as the house, but it was elegant in a way that felt earned rather than displayed. The doorman called her Mrs. Vance without pity. The lobby smelled faintly of cedar and polished stone. For the first time in years, Maria entered a residence that belonged only to her peace. When Daniel learned she was moving out as well, he came to her downstairs study while she was boxing cookbooks. You're leaving too? He asked, stunned. Maria closed the lid of a carton. Yes. But why? The house is yours. Exactly. He stepped closer. Then why should you be the one to go? Maria looked around the room. Because ownership and belonging are no longer the same thing here. He stared at the half-packed shelves. Mom, I know I failed you. Yes, she said. I don't know how to undo it. You don't undo it. You live differently long enough that the damage stops growing. Daniel's eyes shone with the kind of grief men often mistake for helplessness. Are you ever going to forgive me? Maria straightened a stack of books before answering. Forgiveness is not a bridge back to where things were. It is, at best, permission to stop bleeding. We're not there yet. He nodded as if he had expected that. Perhaps part of him had. Elise, by contrast, turned colder as departure became inevitable. She stopped pretending reconciliation was possible and instead retreated into brittle disdain. She made pointed remarks about dramatic legal theater and old-fashioned control. Maria did not respond. Some people, she had learned, mistook silence for defeat because they had never met silence disciplined by certainty. By the time Daniel and Elise finally left the property, their marriage already looked strained under the surface. Bills had followed them. One of Daniel's former partners had disappeared altogether. Invitations from certain friends had slowed. Elise's social ease frayed whenever money entered a conversation. Maria saw all of it and stepped back anyway. Rescue was the habit that had nearly cost her her soul. In Boston, life did not become joyful overnight. That would have been dishonest. Freedom after betrayal often arrives as stillness first, not happiness. There were mornings Maria awoke before dawn, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling and the absence of household noise. There were evenings when she stood at her apartment window looking down at the city lights and felt the ache of motherhood like an old brake in damp weather. But slowly, the air around her changed. She accepted an invitation to consult for a boutique hospitality group whose founder had once hired Vance Table for a winter gala years earlier. At first, she intended to work only lightly, a few menu advisories, staff training sessions, maybe some event design. Yet competence has its own gravity. Soon she was helping shape culinary concepts for 2 small luxury inns and mentoring younger chefs who recognized instantly what Daniel and Elise had forgotten, that Maria Vance was not merely a mother with resources. She was a woman who had built excellence from scratch. One afternoon, after a tasting session, a younger chef named Priya said, "You walk into a kitchen like you already know what's wrong before anyone speaks." Maria smiled faintly. That is because kitchens and families fail for many of the same reasons. Priya laughed, then paused. "You've had to start over before, haven't you?" Maria considered the question. "Yes," she said, "but this is the first time I've done it for myself." Her health improved almost embarrassingly fast. The headaches that had plagued her through the final year in the house eased. Her blood pressure stabilized. She slept. She began taking the long way home through the public garden, buying peonies from a florist on Thursdays, and occasionally meeting other women for dinner without having to check on anyone else's mood before choosing her own. By the second year after the kitchen incident, Maria used part of her remaining sale proceeds to fund a culinary scholarship and training initiative for women over 50 who had been widowed, divorced, displaced, or simply discarded by economies that worship youth. She called it Second Table. The name came to her one evening while setting 2 plates for herself out of habit and then laughing at the symbolism. At the first orientation, 12 women sat in a bright classroom wearing uncertain expressions and practical shoes. Maria stood before them and said, "No one here is too late for a second life. The world may speak as if your usefulness has expired. Let it be wrong." When the women applauded, Maria felt something in her chest lift that had been heavy for years. Her life, at last, was no longer arranged around being needed by people who mistook her devotion for obligation. It was being rebuilt around purpose. And though she still grieved the son she had once believed she understood completely, Maria had begun to recover the woman she had nearly disappeared in order to protect him. 3 years after Maria walked out of that kitchen and called Gregory Hale, the sharpest consequence of that night was no longer legal. It was personal, slow, and impossible to bill or refinance. By then, the damage had matured into something Daniel could no longer explain away with timing, stress, or miscommunication. The life he had tried so hard to preserve through silence had begun collapsing from the inside. And every collapse echoed the same truth. Weakness does not keep peace. It only rents time for worse things to grow. From the outside, Daniel and Elise still looked respectable enough for a while. They moved into a smaller but fashionable rental in an affluent suburb north of the city, the kind of house that photographed well from the front and felt financially panicked from the inside. Elise insisted on keeping the appearance of continuity. They still attended dinners when invited, they still posted carefully edited holiday images, she still wore elegance like armor, Daniel still smiled when required. But the emotional temperature in their marriage had changed completely. Without Maria's quiet financial gravity, everything became more obvious. Bills were no longer absorbed before they became emergencies. There were arguments about cards, subscriptions, deposits, and the absurd cost of maintaining a life that had once been cushioned by someone else's sacrifice. Daniel's business troubles, which he had long minimized, now pressed themselves into daylight. One failed venture had led to another. A partner disappeared, a legal threat surfaced and was resolved only after Daniel drained a retirement account he had barely begun building. At work, he accepted a lower-ranking position than the one he had imagined himself destined for, because imagination had stopped paying for anything. Elise took all of it as a personal insult. "This isn't the life I agreed to," she said one night as they stood in a laundry room turned battleground, a pile of unopened envelopes between them like evidence. Daniel laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because his exhaustion had become acidic. "What exactly do you think you agreed to, Elise? A husband or a permanent aesthetic?" She stiffened. "Don't speak to me as if I'm shallow just because I expect stability." "Stability?" he said. "You wanted polish. There's a difference." Elise folded her arms. "No, Daniel, I wanted a man who could build something." He looked at her for a strange, long moment and felt with a strange hollowness that he was finally seeing the truth without any of the flattering blur he used to put around it. "I had something built for me," he said quietly, "and I stood there while you insulted the person who built it." Elise rolled her eyes in open disgust. "Are we still doing this? Your mother turned one awkward sentence into a dynasty-level legal performance." Daniel's face changed, not dramatically, just enough to show that some threshold had been crossed even in memory. "It was not one sentence." "What do you want me to say?" Elise snapped. "That I should have kept pretending it felt natural to live under her rules in her house forever? That I should have thanked her every morning for choosing our countertops and paying our taxes? That I should have treated her like some saint because she had money and a martyr complex?" Daniel stared at her, and in that moment something inside him stopped defending her permanently. "No," he said, "you should have treated her like a human being, and I should have done the same." Elise turned away, but the marriage never truly turned back after that. By then, Maria's life had moved into a steadier shape in Boston. Daniel knew this from a distance and occasionally from the fragments he heard through others. The hospitality group she advised had expanded. Her second table initiative was gaining recognition in philanthropic circles that respected substance more than spectacle. He had seen her name in a regional magazine beside a photograph that made her look exactly as she had always deserved to look: intelligent, elegant, formidable, and entirely herself. The article mentioned her mentoring work, her late-life career reinvention, and the practical dignity she offered women who had been forced to begin again. Daniel read it alone in his car and wept harder than he had at his father's funeral. The shame was no longer abstract. It had developed structure. He had not merely failed his mother in a tense moment. He had stood beside the diminishment of the person who had built his whole life and let it happen because challenging his wife in front of guests felt uncomfortable. That was the truth. Not complexity, not pressure, cowardice. Refined, well-dressed cowardice. It might have remained an internal collapse if not for the body intervening. Late one November afternoon, after a week of insomnia, client pressure, and domestic warfare so constant it felt atmospheric, Daniel experienced a sudden tightness in his chest while climbing the stairs to his office. He stopped, gripped the railing, and felt dizziness come over him with terrifying speed. For a brief instant he thought, absurdly and clearly, this is how men become stories told by women who were not loved correctly. The emergency room ruled out a major cardiac event, but the physician did not soften the warning. "You are not dying today," she said, reviewing her chart. "But if you keep living exactly like this, eventually your body will choose a more dramatic method of communication." Daniel gave a tired half-smile. "That's encouraging." "It's honest," she replied. "Your blood pressure is elevated, your stress markers are bad, you're sleeping poorly, and based on what you've described, your nervous system has been in conflict mode for years. Something in your life needs to change." Something. The word followed him home. He did not tell Elise everything. She asked whether the tests were serious or merely stress-serious, a distinction that revealed too much about what kind of inconvenience she was prepared to emotionally budget for. Daniel looked at her standing in their kitchen, still beautiful, still perfectly turned out, still somehow more offended by disorder than moved by fear, and understood with a cold steadiness that he could no longer survive the life he had organized around pleasing appearances. For 2 weeks he moved through his days with the disorientation of a man waking from a long, curated sleep. He worked. He ate little. He watched Elise more carefully than he ever had before. He noticed how often she framed problems in terms of embarrassment rather than pain. He noticed, too, how every conflict somehow ended with him apologizing for her sharpness. He noticed, too, how lonely he had become not only in marriage, but in character. Silence had cost him his own respect. Then he did something he had postponed for 3 years. He called Maria. The line rang 4 times. He almost ended it on the 3rd, gripped by the humiliating fear that she might answer with perfect courtesy and no softness at all. But she picked up. "Daniel?" Her voice was calm, neither warm nor cold. It was the voice of a woman who no longer rearranged her emotional furniture at the sound of his footsteps. "Hi, Mom." A pause. "Is something wrong?" He nearly laughed at that. Of course she would go straight to substance. No theatrics, no little punishments, just the central question. "Yes," he said. "A lot of things have been wrong for a long time." She did not rescue him from the sentence. He swallowed. "I'd like to see you, if you're willing." There was a quiet on the line, not uncertain, just deliberate. Finally, she said, "A visit is not the same as repair.